I'd like to continue our discussion of the Yellowstone fauna today. And all of the rest of the animals we're going to be talking about are in the kingdom Metazoa, branch Bilateria, and we left off in the infrakingdom Deuterostomia. And so you may recall those are organisms that in embryonic development, the blastopore will develop into the anus of the reproductive tract. And then within the Deuterostomia, we are going to discuss members of the phylum Chordata. So again, everything else we talk about from here on out are chordates. And again, just quickly reviewing what makes a chordate a chordate. Chordates have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. They will have a supporting tissue for that nerve cord, either what's known as a notochord, a rod of connective tissue. But in the Yellowstone ecosystem, all of the organisms are actually going to have a vertebral column surrounding that nerve cord, and also a cranium surrounding the brain. And then in embryonic development, sometimes to adulthood, you'll have evidence of pharyngeal clefts. All right, so all of the chordates in the Yellowstone ecosystem are vertebrates, members of the subphylum Vertebrata, and these would be chordates that have a vertebral column of either bone or cartilage, and in the Yellowstone ecosystem, the vertebrae are going to be bony vertebrae. And again, there would also be a cranium encapsulating the brain. So before I get into the different vertebrates in the Yellowstone ecosystem, though, I do want to talk a little bit about metabolism. This is something I'll be referring to, and it does impact the behavior and characteristics of animals. And it has to do with, quote unquote, warm-blooded versus cold-blooded animals. Now, we need to be a little more specific than that. And so there are some terms that are kind of either-or terms here. And two terms that I want to look at first are ectothermic versus endothermic. Ectothermic, what the word is trying to say is that heat comes from the outside. And so animals that are ectothermic regulate body temperature through their behavior. So if an animal is ectothermic and it's too hot, it has to move into a cooler environment. If it is too cold, it has to move to a warmer environment if it wants to raise its body temperature. So essentially then body temperature is regulated by behavior. It has to move, and the environment, it has to move to an environment that's warmer or cooler. Now endothermic animals like you and I regulate our body temperature internally, so endothermic, heat from the inside. So we are regulating our body temperatures through physiological mechanisms. So if you and I get cold, we will shiver, and that will generate more heat. That will raise our core temperature. If we get too hot, we sweat, we pant, we do other things to try to get rid of that heat. So again, we're regulating temperature through physiological mechanisms. Now, additionally, the temperature may be relatively constant. So animals that have a relatively constant body temperature, we refer to as being homeothermic. You and I would be homeothermic. And other animals are what we describe as being heterothermic. Hetero means different or other, and so these would be animals that have fluctuating body temperatures. So generally speaking, animals that are ectothermic are also heterothermic. So again, daily and certainly annual body temperatures can fluctuate dramatically depending on environmental temperatures with ectothermic animals. So that's generally what we consider to be a quote-unquote cold-blooded animal. And generally speaking, animals that are endothermic also are homeothermic, just as you and I are. But there are some exceptions, and again, that would be the classic warm-blooded animal. But there are some exceptions to that. Certainly one that we do find in the Yellowstone ecosystem would be bats, for example. They rest in the day and then become active at night, and so their daytime temperatures will drop significantly, and then they'll shiver and warm in the evening and then fly off and bring their temperatures back up. And then also, if you look at animals that hibernate, a lot of the rodents hibernate. Chipmunks, for example, in the ecosystem will hibernate in the winter, and their body temperatures will get near freezing, to be honest with you, compared to their summertime temperatures. So there are some endothermic heterotherms in the ecosystem, but generally endothermic homeotherms. Okay, now one other thing I want to mention about being endothermic is that to be endothermic, you have to have the appropriate anatomy and physiology to do that. And so the bottom line is the delivery of oxygen. If an animal is going to be endothermic, it has to be able to deliver a lot of oxygen to the tissues, and we've talked a little bit about this previously in the course. So you have to be able to deliver a large volume of blood per unit of time. You have to be able to deliver that blood under high pressure to the tissue so that the oxygen is forced out of the tissues, out of the bloodstream into the tissues. And then also your blood needs to be under a high oxygen content. So if you can meet those criteria, then you potentially could be endothermic. And so animals that are not endothermic really lack this capacity to deliver oxygen. Okay, so as we look at vertebrate classes in the Yellowstone ecosystem, the first one we're going to consider are the fishes, the bony fishes, the osteichthyes. And the word osteichthyes, ichthyes is a reference to fish. People who study fish are ichthyologists. Osteo is a reference to bone, so these are the bony fishes. And there are fishes that do not have a bony skeleton. Things like sharks have a cartilaginous skeleton, for example. So these are the bony fishes. And the bony fishes, among other characteristics, have a bony skeleton, as I mentioned. They generally have a two-chambered heart, which is not a particularly efficient heart, so they have trouble delivering adequate oxygen to the tissues. As a result, they're ectothermic heterotherms. They have a cloaca. A cloaca is a common opening for the digestive tract, the reproductive tract, and the urinary tract. And this isn't something I've talked about much yet with animals, but one of the problems that animals have is getting rid of nitrogenous wastes. This is an artifact of metabolizing proteins. When animals metabolize proteins, proteins are broken down into amino acids. We can use amino acids to build our own proteins, but if we aren't building protein, we basically need to do something with the carbons there. And so we break off this ammonia group, or the amino group. The amino group transitions into ammonia, and ammonia is highly toxic to tissues. It's a poison. So animals being multicellular can produce a lot of ammonia. We have to get rid of that ammonia in some way, and so that's what our excretory organs are for, the kidneys are for. So again, eliminating nitrogen-containing waste, nitrogenous waste, is an issue for animals. And fish living in an aquatic environment basically can flush themselves out with water, and they can afford to deal with this very toxic form of nitrogen, which is ammonia. So they excrete ammonia. And we'll compare that to some other animals as we move along through the ecosystem. Also, fish lack copulatory organs, so they are externally fertilizing. They're going to be fertilizing eggs in the water. And then what's an important adaptation for the osteichthyes, and one of the unique features of osteichthyes, is that most species at least, possess an air bladder. And so this, I'll just go ahead and show you anatomically what that is. So if we look at the anatomy of the fish then, the air bladder or swim bladder is a really important physical feature. And it has specialized blood vessels associated with it, and so they can actually add gases to that air bladder or remove gases from that air bladder. And it's usually oxygen, primarily oxygen, but it can also be a combination of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Anyway, what that does for the fish is that it allows it to basically float at a particular place in the water column. So this contrasts with, say, sharks. Sharks do not possess a swim bladder. And so if a shark is a pelagic free-swimming shark, if it stops swimming, it's going to start to sink. So it constantly has to expend energy to maintain itself in the water column. The bony fishes have an advantage in this way in that they can just adjust the amount of gas in the swim bladder, and they can float at a particular place in the water column, and they're not constantly fighting to stay at a particular spot. So that's a major adaptation for them. Again, the cloaca is a common opening, again, for the digestive tract, the reproductive tract, and the kidneys would produce urethra, which would release ammonia in this case out as well. Also, another characteristic of the deuterostomates I had mentioned previously is that in deuterostomates, when a heart and spinal cord are present, which is in all the vertebrates, the heart will be ventral or on the belly surface compared to the nerve cord, which will be dorsal or along the back. And that is switched in the protostomate animals. Now, when you look at fish and adaptations that fish have, to their environment, obviously they have a torpedo-like shape, and that's very significant because it makes them hydrodynamic, makes them cut through the water really well. In classifying fish, you'll also look at the scales, the type of scales that the fish have. That is considered an important characteristic in classification. As we look at the different types of fins that we see in the bony fishes, they'll typically be dorsal fins, an anterior and posterior dorsal fin. The tail fin is called the caudal fin. And the fishes that we're going to be talking about are described as being homocircle, meaning that it's proportional. The upper and lower portions of the fin are proportional to one another. There will be an anal fin adjacent to the opening for the cloaca, pelvic fins, and which are paired, and then also pectoral fins, which are paired. So pelvic fins and pectoral fins. So again, the type of fin, nature of the fins, the type of scales that they have would be some of the things that you look at in classifying fishes, among many other features. Now, the fishes in the Yellowstone ecosystem belong to a subclass known as the Actinopterygii. What they're telling us is that they are the ray-finned fishes. And so they have bony rays that extend into the fins, as opposed to fleshy lobes. And then within that subclass, the order Teleostei. And the Teleostei is the most successful group of fishes, the most advanced group of fishes. So in the Yellowstone ecosystem, there are 11 native species. Some of them are important to sport fishermen and generate a lot of income in the area and attract people there to catch them. So one of these is the Arctic grayling, which is pretty rare in the lower 48. So again, not a huge population in Yellowstone. It's a beautiful, kind of mid-sized fish. They have a really spectacular dorsal fin when that's extended up, which is very distinctive for the Arctic grayling. And it has kind of a limited range in Yellowstone. I know they're working to try to extend that range a little bit, but mainly around the Madison River area. And then the major trout, the endemic trout to the area, the native trout to the area, is the cutthroat trout. And there are three varieties: the Yellowstone cutthroat, the West Slope cutthroat, and the Snake River cutthroat trout. And the cutthroat trout is a really beautiful fish. It's related to the rainbow trout, so that it can have some really spectacular colors. I'm not sure that these photographs will show us that too well. This photograph, again, doesn't really show us the colors too well in the body, but what you can see is where the cutthroat gets its name. It has these red markings on the mandible, and that's really distinctive of the cutthroat trout. And the cutthroats, the West Slope cutthroats, are found mainly up in the northwestern portion of the ecosystem, or in Yellowstone Park, I should say. And then the Yellowstone cutthroat is found through most of the rest of the park. The Snake River cutthroat is found in the Snake River drainage. And then another native fish, which some consider a game fish, others not so much, is the mountain whitefish. It's a relative of the trout, not a true trout. And you find it throughout the ecosystem in both rivers and in lakes, primarily feeding on vegetation. Also, almost all of these fishes are opportunistic. They'll feed on whatever they can, especially aquatic insects that we've talked about. And then some other fishes, there are some suckers, suckerfish. There are three different types of suckerfish we find in the ecosystem. Suckerfish are really distinctive looking. You'll find them again in a lot of the lakes and rivers throughout the entire ecosystem. You can see that their mouth is kind of displaced towards their belly surface, and so they'll move along the bottom. They also will scrape algae off of rocks, but they're kind of opportunistic feeders, primarily herbivores. And you can see the kind of bizarre mouth that they have. But these guys can get pretty big. They're one of the biggest fish that you find in the ecosystem. And then mottled sculpin would be another native fish species. And there are also 4 species of minnows, which are just small fish kind of at the bottom of the food chain as it relates to fishes in the ecosystem. Now, there are also non-native species, and we're going to look at really trout species as non-native species in the ecosystem. And so one of these would be the brown trout. Another is the brook trout, rainbow trout, and the lake trout. So the lake trout is also called the Mackinac trout, and the lake trout is really problematic in ecosystem. It's basically the big bad wolf of the ecosystem, and it's really a problem as it relates to the native cutthroat trout population. So the native cutthroat trout population is crashing. There's some significant threats to that trout population, and so I'd actually like you to watch some videos that we taped up in the Yellowstone ecosystem explaining the threats to the cutthroat trout population. I'm standing in Lahardy Rapids of the Yellowstone River of Yellowstone National Park. And this illustrates one of the challenges for the native cutthroat trout. The cutthroat trout is a river trout that's going to be living downriver, yet they have to make their way upstream to the shallows of Lake Yellowstone where they will spawn. And as you can see, during the snowmelt, late spring, early summer, they've got quite a challenge here. And so most people wouldn't think that trout could navigate this, but trout actually are in the same family as salmon. And at certain times of the year, you'll literally see the trout jumping just as you would see salmon jumping. And one of the places where you can view the trout are along the sides of the river. So they'll make their way upstream and then they'll work into the shallows, into the eddies and rest for a while, and then work back into the current and eventually get up to those shallows around Lake Yellowstone where they will spawn. For the cutthroat trout that live within 5 miles of Lake Yellowstone and the Yellowstone River, this is the eventual destination, assuming they survive the rigors of the Hardy Rapids. So they come here to the shallows near Lake Yellowstone, near Fishing Bridge, to spawn. And once the eggs hatch, the fry will move into the shallows of the lake and spend the first couple of years of their lives in the lake before moving downriver to their eventual habitats. Now, cutthroat trout don't only live in Lake Yellowstone and they don't only live within 5 miles of the lake. So cutthroat trout tend to move either downstream or upstream in all of the tributaries that drain into and lead out of Lake Yellowstone to find situations like this where the river is moving slowly and there's a sandy bottom so that they can spawn. Now, the cutthroat trout population, unfortunately, is in a very bad situation. The population is crashing dramatically. And so next I want to talk about the 3 major threats to the cutthroat trout population and why cutthroat trout are so important to this ecosystem. I'm sitting on the shores of Lake Yellowstone in Yellowstone National Park, and this is home to one of the 3 major threats to the cutthroat trout population. In the mid-1990s, lake biologists discovered that a very large trout known as the lake trout was living in Lake Yellowstone. And they were very concerned about this because when they would open these trout up, they found out that they were eating the cutthroat fingerlings. So as I mentioned earlier, in the tributaries to the lake, within about 2 to 5 miles of the lake, the cutthroats will make their way to the lake, spawn here, and the fingerlings will live in the lake, and some trout themselves take up residence in the lake. So the lake trout were feeding on these cutthroats, and again, that cutting into the population that would eventually migrate back out into the rivers. So to give you an idea of the effect that they have had on the cutthroat trout population, if you go back to the 1970s and look at the fish counts of the fish migrating per day into the lake, those numbers were 70 to 80,000 cutthroats per day migrating to the lake. Now those numbers are down into the 30s or 40s. So the lake trout has had a tremendous impact on the cutthroat trout population. So to mitigate the effects of lake trout then, lake biologists are gill netting in the lake using fairly large gill nets to try to catch large lake trout but not catch cutthroats. And there is hope that they can eventually stabilize that lake population at a fairly low number. However, the number of lake trout caught each year continues to increase, so there is some concern about that. Also, a little bit of an interesting side story to this. A class that I led up here that first year when they discovered the lake trout had a student that had done some research on the cutthroat trout. And that particular year there were posters everywhere that said, reward $10,000 for capture and conviction of those responsible for introduction of the lake trout to this ecosystem. And so that particular student, while here, did some research in the local park libraries and actually discovered that the Park Service itself had introduced lake trout into a number of lakes in the park, including Lake Yellowstone. So needless to say, the next year when we came back, those posters were no longer being displayed. Well, here on the shore of Lake Yellowstone, I'd like to discuss 2 other major threats to the native cutthroat trout population. One of those is an animal parasite which causes whirling disease. Whirling disease is where the trout actually begin to swim in circles due to neurological damage, and they eventually starve and die. The other threat is caused by the New Zealand mud snail. And the New Zealand mud snail will degrade the environment, makes it so that some of the larval insects that the fry trout would normally feed on will not be as available. And so this degradation of habitat also then has an impact on the population. So between the lake trout, the causative organism of whirling disease, and the New Zealand mud snail, there's been a huge impact on the cutthroat trout population, as I mentioned before. So you might be asking yourself, well, what difference does it make? Why do we really need cutthroat trout? Can't the lake trout, for example, take their place? And the answer is that the lake trout cannot replace the cutthroat trout because the lake trout is literally a lake trout. It's a deep water lake trout. This is where it lives, in lakes. Whereas the cutthroat trout migrate into the rivers and streams, and that's where they live. And then they are a very important food source for a number of animals in the ecosystem, including the white pelican, the bald eagle, osprey, and grizzly bear. and particularly the sow grizzly bears when they have cubs and also while they're pregnant. That has historically been a very important food source for them. So this crashing population then is going to essentially have a domino effect, what we call a trophic cascade, that potentially is devastating to the entire ecosystem. Now, there are a couple of follow-ups I'd like to make to that I want to make sure that you're clear on. One is that when I was talking about the decline in the cutthroat trout population, those that are coming to the Yellowstone Lake to spawn, that I mentioned that there used to be 70 or 80,000 and those numbers are down to 30 or 40. I want to make clear that I mean 30 or 40. I don't mean 30 or 40,000. We're talking about an unbelievable decline from 70 or 80,000 to 30 or 40 fish per day. And that's also not talking about all of the tributaries of the lake. That's really looking at just one tributary. And those particular numbers come from Pelican Creek. But we have seen significant declines in a lot of the other tributaries feeding into the lake as well. So again, this is just an extraordinary decline. And they are trying to reseed some of the streams that lead into the ecosystem by reintroducing fertilized eggs to some of the spawning grounds near the lake, and we'll see if that works down the line. Now, another thing I do want to mention, getting back to the lake trout, at least the good news on lake trout is it does have a relatively confined habitat, which would be Lake Yellowstone, also Heart Lake, Lewis Lake, and Shoshone Lake. So the good news is also that they're not spread throughout the entire ecosystem yet. We hope it stays that way, and they're relatively confined in terms of the damage that they're doing. Another thing that's kind of interesting in ecosystem as it relates to the trout population is that, as we've talked about, trout are ectothermic heterotherms, and so they do have difficulty regulating body temperature. And one of the places where this becomes problematic is in the Firehole River. The Firehole River takes its name from the fact that there's a lot of geothermal springs, hot springs, feeding into the river. And so there have been years when I've been up there where, especially when it's been a hot summer, when we've had some droughts going, and of course we've got really a 20-year drought going on, but as water levels get low, you've got a hot summer, and then you have hot springs feeding into the river. What happens is that the trout then are really right on the edge of whether they can survive or not. If they pick up their physical activity, then their demands for oxygen become greater than their ability to supply oxygen to the tissues. So there have been years when I've been up there where the Firehole River has actually been closed to fishing. Now, most of the fishing in the ecosystem is that it's catch and release. But the problem here is that even though you might be releasing the fish, you will have extended the fish so severely through the physical activity of catching it that it won't be able to get enough oxygen to its tissues because of the elevated temperatures, and it will essentially suffocate and die. So anyway, that is one of the problems with being an ectothermic heterotherm is you can't regulate your own temperature like we can. And so again, that Firehole River is over here on the west side where there's a lot of geothermal features. Now, as we look at the Yellowstone ecosystem, and if we look evolutionarily then, the first terrestrial vertebrates to evolve were the Amphibia. And there are a number of intermediates that we see in the fossil record, and at one time they were the dominant terrestrial animal. Now, the amphibians, as the name implies, are capable of living on land, but they also are tied to water, and they're not completely adapted to living on land. And so one of the things I'd like you to look at to see that is if you just look at the skeleton itself more or less tells us that. So when you look at the skeleton of a frog that we have here, this is a bullfrog, which we don't find in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but just notice how the limbs are displaced laterally rather than being underneath, and so they don't really get off the ground very well. They're not really very good in terms of walking around on land. They're good in water, but not great on land. But certainly they have limbs, so they are capable of walking on land. So this is an animal that's partially adapted to life on land, but not fully adapted to life on land. So as we look at characteristics of the amphibia, again, as I mentioned, they're the first terrestrial vertebrates that we find in the fossil record. They lack what's called a keratinized skin. Keratinized skin is what you and I have. Keratinized skin basically serves as an exoskeleton. It can be protective, but it also seals water in. It's not very water permeable. And so this is significant for the amphibians because they do have lungs, obviously, and they can respire air in and out of the lungs, but the lungs are not particularly efficient. So they also have to respire through the skin. So they actually have to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide through the skin in addition to their lungs. If they had a keratinized skin like you and I, they would not be able to respire through the skin like that. So it's not that they don't have any keratin, it's just that they don't have keratin like reptiles do, birds do, and we mammals do. And the texture of keratin basically is your fingernails. So again, they don't have this kind of exoskeleton that seals water in and prevents gas exchange. They need to be able to exchange gases through the skin. And this is another reason why they need wet or very humid environments. So they also require water for reproduction. They lay their eggs in the water. The eggs have to develop in water. They also go through a metamorphosis, a tadpole stage that has gills. They will then transition to a juvenile stage where the tail begins to be absorbed, lungs begin to grow, and the gills will be reabsorbed, and eventually into the adult stage. And then also, as I mentioned initially, the eggs themselves have to be laid in water, sometimes fertilized in water, but certainly laid in water and fertilized as they're laid. And then they have to develop in water, so they cannot develop on dry land. They also lack copulatory organs, so again, this is a negative in terms of life on land, so they have to fertilize externally, just essentially like a fish would do. And so they'll put their cloacas adjacent to one another. Usually a male will find the female as she lays her eggs and then fertilize as she lays her eggs. They also, like fish, have a cloaca, again, common opening for reproductive, digestive, and urinary systems. And also they do excrete ammonia for the most part, just as fishes do. They have a slightly more efficient heart. It's known as a three-chambered heart. It still has limitations in terms of oxygen delivery, however, so as a result, amphibians are ectothermic heterotherms. Now, when we look at the amphibia, there are two orders that we'll find in the Yellowstone ecosystem. One of these orders is the Anura. The Anura is composed of both frogs and toads, and there are relatively few of those in the ecosystem, and there's really just a single order of chaudates, which are the salamanders. And so the order Caudata then would be, or Urodela, are salamanders. So what I'll be doing in the next module then is that we'll come back to the amphibia. We'll look at the different types of anurans and Caudata that we find in the ecosystem. So I'll see you next time.